Well, we're continuing on in our series on what happens when we die. We did a little bit of, I got through most of last week's lesson doing a bit of introduction on the Old Testament view of the afterlife. We're going to pick up with the end of that. We're going to look at some passages today. Rather than just me droning on and on, we're just going to look at some individual passages. And if you want to go ahead and turn to the first one, it's 1 Samuel 28, 13 through 15. We're still highlighting some of the ideas of the afterlife. And after this passage in 1 Samuel 28, 13 through 15, I'll make reference back to some of the passages that we briefly mentioned last week involving Enoch and Elijah and Abraham. And then we're going to look specifically at Old Testament resuscitation. And then technically our next lesson, which we're starting today and maybe finishing, I don't know, we're just all playing this by ear, will be Old Testament resurrection. So we'll do a bit of compare and contrast between the two. There is a difference between resuscitation and resurrection. Hopefully that will be, it'll start to become apparent. And once again, I think I mentioned this last week, we need to be careful about when we look at a passage, especially this first one in 1 Samuel 28, it's a kind of a dangerous thing to pull back and say, well, there it is. That's what the afterlife is all about. That's how it's going to be. We got all of our answers. Well, let's just wrap the whole series up here and we'll start something else. It's a glass we see through darkly regarding the afterlife and resuscitation and resurrection. It's not abundantly clear. And we're kind of cobbling together a pretty good understanding of what all of this is. And there is a bridge between the Old Testament and the New Testament. As a matter of fact, we'll get to one of those bridge passages after we look at Old Testament resuscitation, when we start specifically looking at Old Testament resurrection. And once again, when we look at the passages that do reference Old Testament resurrection, it's not going to be it may not be apparent. And if you want to ask, well, how exactly is this, even after an explanation, then ask. Don't hesitate to ask questions. So 1 Samuel 28, 13 through 15, if somebody could read that passage, please.
And the king said to her, "Do not be afraid. What did you see?" And the woman said, to Saul, "I saw a spirit ascending out of the earth." So he said to her, "What is this for?" And she said, "An old man is coming up, and he is covered with a mantle." And Saul perceived that it was Samuel, and he stooped with his face to the ground and bowed down. Now Samuel said to Saul, "Why have you disturbed me, bringing me up?" And Saul answered, "I am deeply distressed, for the Philistines make war against me, and God has departed from me, and does not answer me anymore, neither by prophets nor by dreams. Therefore I have called you, that you may reveal to me what I shall do."
This is one of those unusual passages, and it's something that we do need to look at, but there's really nothing else like this in all of Scripture, for more than one reason. It's kind of like when we get into the New Testament and we look at the thief on the cross. We have a tendency to see that as a nice clear snapshot. Well, what Jesus is telling the thief is that you're going to be in heaven today. And it's not really that's exactly what's going on. But it's kind of the same thing with this passage. It does demonstrate some things, but not necessarily abundantly clearly. It does demonstrate, first of all, that there is an afterlife. This is not some sort of demonic apparition that Satan has pulled out, or if you're familiar with this passage, the witch of Endor. This is Samuel. This is the prophet Samuel. And he has been, however we describe it, he is been brought back to this plane. I don't want to say he's been brought back to life, because we're not really sure what form he's in. And I'll kind of highlight that when we get to the end of this passage. But there is some sort of afterlife. It's not as though the witch of Endor tries to call up Samuel, and it's not possible, because when you die, you're annihilated and that's it. This points toward the fact that there's something going on after our physical death. So there is an afterlife. Second, it is possible to contact the dead, although that is forbidden. Deuteronomy 18:9 through 12 forbids this. We're not supposed to do that. And it's not necessarily what we think. Divination or necromancy is forbidden because what you're doing is you're seeking a source other than God for answers. That's what Saul's doing here. God is no longer talking to Saul, and Saul wants answers. So if God won't give him an answer, he'll find another source. Well, you're not supposed to find another source. Even if it's a restored, I'll use that word, a restored prophet of God. His days have come and gone, and his days of informing God's people have come and gone. Third, that the dead are conscious. There is a consciousness to Samuel, and he does retain some memory of his earthly life. It's not a matter of, well, how did I get here, and who are all you people? He knows who Saul is. Saul eventually knows who Samuel is. So it's not as though the afterlife, we abandon a full consciousness of this life. There's something that we carry over, at least an awareness or memory or whatever it may be. Fourth, that the dead have an unearthly appearance. In this passage, where's my verse? In verse 13, about halfway through, when it says, the woman said, I see a spirit coming up out of the ground. Does somebody have a word other than spirit? Everybody have spirit? Divine. You have a divine?
Ghostly figure.
A ghostly figure?
Divine being or God.
A divine being or God. The word actually is God. So the reason why I highlight it is because that word spirit is a little deceptive. Because the actual Hebrew word is the word for God. That doesn't mean that Samuel's a God. What it means is his appearance is not as it was before he died. He looks different. There's something different about him. He's not a God, but to say, well, the woman says, I see a spirit, so that's his soul, that's his spirit come back from the dead. Well, no, not necessarily. It's because I don't want us to oversimplify the passage, but at the same time, if you're left a little confused, welcome to the last few thousand years of trying to figure out the specifics and the details of this passage. It's just not abundantly clear what form Samuel is in. A mantle, it's his cloak or some sort of covering, usually a nice long one, which means it's probably something familiar that causes Saul to say, hey, I know you. It's kind of like saying, so-and-so always wore that tie. That's whoever, or I could tell him by his shoes or something like that. It's something familiar that's affirming this is Samuel, but it may not be Samuel's physical appearance. It may be something else.
Well, it says that the woman saw him. Mm-hmm. I don't see that it says that Saul saw Satan.
Well, he is conversing with Saul. Yeah. And my assumption is she has informed him, and now he knows. So I'm assuming he can see him.
The king says to her, what do you see?
Mm-hmm. And then what does he look like? An old man wearing a robe. And then he knows it is. So however he knows, whatever he sees, there is some sort of recognition. However that plays out, adding to the confusion of this passage. It's something along those lines.
He's sitting there talking to her, and she's seeing it, and it's like crystal ball in the middle, what it sounds like.
She seems to be functioning like a medium, as opposed to an extra large. I knew somebody was thinking that. Somehow she's communicating initially through them, but then they begin to converse seemingly back and forth with one another. So once again, we don't have all the details.
One very interesting thing too about Samuel's appearance is that I think kind of proves it really is Samuel is the fact that when Saul asked him for more information, he neither added to nor took away from what God already told him. Mm-hmm. Whereas if it were a lying spirit, tried to deceive Saul. But here Samuel neither adds to nor takes away from what God already told him.
And I think you're absolutely right. I think that's affirming this is Samuel, rather than something demonic or some sort of spirit that is intending to deceive him. And he probably can't add to or take away because he hasn't received any other communications from God. God is finished in this life with Samuel. Samuel has served faithfully God, and his time is done. He has retired, and he has moved on to some other type of existence. And then lastly and primarily, there's a question that Samuel asks in verse 15. Why have you disturbed me by bringing me up? Which sounds unusual, but it's probably giving credence to the idea that there's some sort of rest or repose or peace. There's some sort of state that he was in that he's no longer in. It's been disturbed. I was there and now I'm here, and I don't want to be here. I want to be there. And the big question is, well, what's the there? You tell me. It's not abundantly clear. Whatever the there is, I think we can rule out a couple of things. Probably. It's probably not heaven. He's probably not in the presence of God. It's probably an intermediate state between his death and his resurrection. In other words, it's life after death before life after death, which is resurrection.
In his parable about the rich man and Lazarus, Jesus describes it as being in Abraham's bosom.
Mm-hmm.
So we know it's a place of rest.
Yeah, there is some sort of repose there. And that's not really clear.
People are conscious there.
Mm-hmm. They're conscious there. They're aware. Also, from that parable, we can't pull too much from it, but from that parable, God's aware of what's going on. They're aware of God, and they're also aware of each other. Lazarus and the rich man know of the others there. So whatever it is, it seems to be some sort of intermediate state. Whatever that is, we're not sure. If you're hoping for clarity from this passage, good luck with that. It's just not. It's just not there. Now, the last question is: in what form is Samuel? Is this his soul? Is this his body? Is this his soul and body? It's probably his soul and body, because Hebrew theology embraces the idea of the nephesh, that body and soul don't separate. Although there are some Jewish beliefs that come much later that the soul separates from the body. But for the most part, soul separation, the disembodied spirit, is more of a pagan idea. It clearly can be found among all sorts of non-Jewish groups and pre-Christian paganism. So I think we need to be careful because then you're talking about one exception to all of Scripture's rule, which is the body and the soul don't separate. What we do clearly know, Samuel has not experienced resurrection. Can't experience resurrection until Jesus' resurrection.
In verse 14, where he says, then Saul knew it was Samuel, and he bowed down and prostrated himself with his face to the ground.
Mm-hmm.
Is that out of respect to the dead, or does he make eye contact at some point, or does he stay that way through the conversation?
He
Like this, is he talking to him, but afraid to look, or?
I think it's more fear than respect. There may have been a little bit of going into this scene, and I know I'm doing some eisegesis reading into the text, but there may have been some, this probably isn't going to work, and then all of a sudden it works, and he's probably scared. I don't know.
Well, he did go to Samuel for answers.
Mm-hmm.
So it would make sense, if he had confidence in the process, it would make sense that he would bow down to him.
Mm-hmm.
Because he's respecting him for wisdom.
It may be that. It may be genuine fear. It may be reverence. It may be, holy cow, this actually worked. And it also may be, I know it's Samuel, but he doesn't quite look like Samuel. When we get into the Gospels, when we and we dealt with this when we looked briefly anyway, when we looked at the Gospel of John, people don't recognize Jesus right off the bat. He's changed. He's different in his appearance, and that may be what's going on here. You may not quite recognize Samuel.
Did he bow down before him before he died?
No, to my knowledge, no.
Then that would be telling there. Maybe he's recognizing this is not an earthly event. This is different.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know exactly how I'm supposed to react, so I'm going to get down and give a submission, show submission to whatever this is.
Which he shouldn't have done because Samuel's not God. That type of bow and reverence should only come to God. So I don't know. I looked at that and thought, is he scared? Is he reverential? What's going on here? Not really sure. Not exactly sure. I can say this definitively. Samuel has not experienced resurrection. There's no resurrection going on here. This is not a resurrection event. Even if this is his body, and I believe it is his nephesh, his life, his body, soul combined, I think that's what has appeared. And it may be something more akin to the Mount of Transfiguration, where Moses and Elijah appear before Jesus. And we'll look at that, whatever that means. Not really sure. Sometimes there are these strange exceptions in the Old Testament, and you can't put too much weight on them. That's the main thing I want you to, well, it's one of the main things I want you to draw from this. There's a lot of other things here. There is an afterlife. There's communication with the afterlife. Also, you can communicate with the dead, but we're not supposed to. And I'm really hoping nobody asks this question. Well, how exactly did she do this? I don't know. I don't care. Yeah, this is the Witch of Endor. But this is not a resurrection event. And this is probably something, well, for more than one reason, this is something that wasn't supposed to happen. Because first of all, God has said, don't go looking for other sources outside of me. Whether they are false gods or whether you are communicating with your dearly departed as a source of guidance and direction, I'm your source of guidance and direction. Not even dead prophets are supposed to give you guidance and direction, only me. Because Samuel only spoke on God's behalf. God is still guiding Israel, guiding Saul and others through Samuel. It's still God's guidance. Without God involved in this process, there's no direction from God, which is the main thing. And then the other thing that we can draw from this, Samuel was dead, and he's in some sort of post-mortem state, whatever that is, wherever that is, however that is, and he wants to still be there, and he don't want to be back here. And I'm sure that answers. Yes, Winnie.
I'm just thinking here, having worked as a chaplain for 7 years, I was just thinking, how long was this? How long was he, dead before he was consulted? The background to that is that I know of a lady, she was in a coma, just being on life support for 3 months. And she was saying that she could hear everything that was saying when people wanted to remove everything so that she goes on. And she was trying to say, please, I'm still alive, I'm still alive. But they couldn't hear her, but she heard everything. But 3 months later, she was okay. I don't know how long she lived after that, but she was out of the hospital. So here I'm just thinking, how many days was Samuel that, dead before he was consulted? I don't know.
I don't know. I do know, I don't think it's contemporary with this time period. This is around about the year 1000 BC, something like that. That's about the time of David. Much later, there's this idea that a soul would hover around a grave, among Jews, a soul would hover around the grave for about 3 days afterwards. And then finally, the life, not the soul would depart and go to heaven, but the life would depart and the body's truly dead. That's why Jesus delays going back to raise Lazarus from the dead, so that everybody who sees that event knows This man is dead. His soul wasn't hovering nearby and suddenly got sucked back into him, and Jesus didn't really raise him from the dead. The indications are Samuel's dead, completely dead, and this is a unique phenomenon. But I don't know how long.
Thank you.
You're welcome. And there are differences between this and what we looked at last week with Enoch and Elijah. Enoch and Elijah don't experience death. Enoch is there, and then he's not there. Elijah is taken up in a chariot of fire. Those are very different events. And then when we talked a bit about Abraham, we talk about him joining with his ancestors. And this is a very different thing. This is another one of those unique expressions. And it's not just Abraham, but other patriarchs have that same type of experience. But all indications are that none of these are in the presence of God. Even probably, I said probably, even probably Enoch and Elijah. And that always begs the question, where do they go? They must have gone to heaven. Well, we don't really know. Indications seem to be they probably, most likely, perhaps, maybe were in that intermediate state, but not yet in God's presence. If we place this in the context of the rest of the Old Testament, there is no statement of you die, you go to heaven in the Old Testament. It's just not there. So they must not have been in the presence of God. They must have been in that intermediate state. But Samuel experienced death. Abraham experienced death. Enoch and Elijah didn't, but they all end up in the same place, in the same state, in the same situation.
So what you're saying, there's a waiting room in the afterlife as well as...
It seems to be. And it's not purgatory. I know where you're going with that, Alan. We'll talk about purgatory later on, but not just yet. It's nothing purgatorial. There's no purging that's going on, but there seems to be a waiting room. It's not Sheol. You don't hang out and, looking at your watch, wondering when is this stuff going to end and when is Jesus coming and we're going to wrap this up. We don't really know, but it seems to be a place of repose, of release from this life, and you're content with being released from the burdens of this life, whatever that means. I'm sure that's as clear as mud. Now, let's look at three passages that are discussing Old Testament resuscitation, not resurrection, but resuscitation. The first one is in 1 Kings 17 through 24. So not too far away, just keep going to the right in your Bible. 1 Kings 17 through 24. I'm not going to make anybody read that. I'll read it, but I will. I've got two shorter passages that you all can read. Sometime later, the son of the woman who owned the house became ill. He grew worse and worse and finally stopped breathing. She said to Elijah, "What do you have against me, man of God? Did you come to remind me of my sin and kill my son? Give me your son," Elijah replied. He took him from her arms, carried him to the upper room where he was staying, and laid him on his bed. Then he cried out to the Lord, "Lord, my God, have you brought tragedy even on this widow I'm staying with by causing her son to die?" Then he stretched himself out on the boy 3 times and cried out to the Lord, "Lord, my God, let this boy's life return to him." That's an important phrase. The Lord heard Elijah's cry, and the boy's life returned to him, and he lived. Elijah picked up the child and carried him down from the room into the house. He gave him to his mother and said, "Look, your son is alive." Then the woman said to Elijah, "Now I know that you are a man of God, and that the word of the Lord from your mouth is the truth." So this is a resuscitation event. There's 2 others that I just want to look at briefly, then we'll kind of give some reflection on it. This one's in 2 Kings, so not too far away. 2 Kings 4, 32 through 37. You didn't know we were going to do Bible drill today. 2 Kings 4, 32 through 37. And if somebody, when you arrive, could read that passage.
When
So he entered and shut the door behind them both and prayed to the Lord. And he went up and lay on the child, put his mouth on his mouth, and his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And he stretched himself on him, and the flesh of the child became warm. Then he returned and walked in the house once back and forth, and went up and stretched himself on him. And the lad sneezed 7 times, and the lad opened his eyes. He called Gehazi and said, "Call the Shunammite." So he called her. And when she came into him, he said, "Take up your son." Then she went in and fell at his feet and bowed herself to the ground. And she took up her son and went out.
So similar to what we just read in 1 Kings, this one involving Elisha rather than Elijah. And then if you turn to chapter 13, still 2 Kings 13, just one verse, verse 21. If somebody could read 2 Kings 13, 21.
It came about as they were burying the man, behold, they saw a rotting man, so they threw the body into Elisha's tomb. As soon as the man's body touched Elisha's bones, he came back to life and stood up on his feet.
Now, I have to be honest, I was completely unfamiliar with this passage. I'd never come across this one before. Is anybody else? Anybody ever heard a good sermon based on this verse? Or I was completely unfamiliar with this event. This, once again, is a Old Testament resuscitation, and you'll notice there's some things that parallel these 3 passages. First of all, you have a living body touching a dead body. And it's usually in connection with one of these 2 prophets. So it may not just be any old body, living or dead. You'll notice living or dead. There is a contact with the body, and that it seems to be connected to a prophetic body.
Well, maybe you said it, but this is a dead body touching a dead body.
But it's a body. It's not just, there's no incantation, not even just a prayer. Even though a prayer is given by Elijah, he does pray to God, but he puts his body, is that the one 3 times on the boy? Yeah, 3 times. And please don't ask about the 7 sneezes. 7 is a biblical number. There you go. Every time I sneeze repeatedly, I feel like I'm going to die and not come back to life. But anyway, yes, I feel like I need resuscitation. But the main point of these 3 passages is that these are not resurrection events. This is not a person who has died, who has been raised from the dead and transformed. This is a person who has died, and that same body that has died has been brought back to life. Life has been restored. This is not a new life. This is not a new body. Not new, and we'll get, when we look more closely at resurrection, not new as in different, but new as in not quite the same, which I know sounds like I'm doing a little bit of political doublespeak there. It is a new body, but it's this old body as well. But it's the old body that's become a new body. Resurrection is different than resuscitation. This is resuscitation. Now, a lot of biblical scholars will argue this is a foreshadowing of resurrection, which will be, and we'll look at some passages here when we start looking at Old Testament resurrection. There are passages that begin to develop the concept of resurrection in the Old Testament. It is there. This is not it. But this is kind of a foreshadowing to say that what God did to this person or to these individuals, he's going to do for others, and then eventually we'll develop the idea of universal resurrection. Clearly in the Old Testament, not quite as clear in the New Testament. Clearly in the New Testament, not quite as clear in the Old Testament. But that's a different thing. This might be a proleptic form of resurrection, but it's not resurrection. Proleptic, it happens before it happens. It's kind of like when people talk about something like, well, we had a Renaissance in the 10th century. No, there's only one real Renaissance, and that's the one in the 13th, 14th, 15th centuries. So that would be kind of a better example might be John Wycliffe, 14th century churchman, is often viewed as a proto or pre-Protestant. He was a Protestant before they're Protestants, so that's what proleptic means. It's something that happens before it happens.
You know, it's interesting, is that the person didn't come back from the dead, but it's like God uses the presence of people to make miraculous things happen, like when Peter went through the shadow of Peter.
Oh yeah,
And so it's like I say, it's not resurrected, but the person's life was changed just by the presence of someone else. So it shows me that God uses people. It's amazing how that works.
For resuscitation.
Can you define resurrection and resuscitation specifically? I mean, these people were clinically dead.
Mm-hmm. They're dead.
There's not a perception of death. They are clinically dead.
They're dead. No life. Resuscitation is this body brought back to life. Resurrection is this body brought back to life, but transformed into a new body. Jesus' resurrected body was not the same body, but it was the same body. I know that sounds like I'm saying two different things. Same Jesus, same person, same experience, same memories, same everything. Same body, but then transformed into a new body in order to be able to enter into the new creation. What that means, another way of approaching it may be, what you got is what you got, but it's going to be better. It's going to be new. And once again, getting back to a conversation Roger and I had before, I don't know if this scarred finger of mine is still going to look the same or God's going to heal it. Don't care, doesn't matter. I'll probably still have a 5'3" body, and I'm fine with that.
We're gonna have 6 senses. We'll be enhanced.
I guess so.
That's my prediction.
Okay. Then run with that. If that'll preach on a Sunday morning, then preach it, brother, preach it. I know. But anyway, I'm sure it will in some places. Just don't go to those places. So when these individuals are resuscitated, they're just brought back to the same life they had before. Nothing's changed. They will be, in the future, resurrected. Does that make sense? When Lazarus is brought back from the dead, he still is going to die, and he will still be raised from the dead and resurrected. So he's resuscitated, and he'll be resurrected. Does that make sense? Or does that confuse you even more?
I can grasp that.
Okay. I don't doubt anyone's intelligence. I doubt my explanation for anything, usually. So these are individuals that have died. Then their old body has been simply been brought back to life. Life has been restored to them. I don't know how that happened. But they will die again, and they will experience a resurrection again. They will experience a resurrection where they will be transformed.
There's kind of a mystery here. When Lazarus was brought back from the dead, he is the only one that I know of that was mentioned after that, briefly. But Jairus' daughter and all of these other people who had died and were brought back, all of a sudden you never hear from them again. And that's maybe because that's not relevant to what God wants to tell us. But that's probably the most logical explanation, but there's still kind of a mystery here.
There really is. Indications are, obviously, they're not living perpetually. They have not been resurrected, because they would have been resurrected before Jesus was resurrected. So they can't experience resurrection until after he opens that door of that possibility of resurrection. And if they had been restored to everlasting life, then we'd still be hanging out with Lazarus.
Lazarus, let's say, well and truly died, was dead. He was in the ground 4 days. The Bible says it is appointed unto man once to die and then the judgment. So would Lazarus be required to suffer physical death again? Or at some point after Jesus' resurrection, would he just simply be resurrected in the dark. There may be a kind of a precedent for that. When Jesus died, all these Old Testament saints who came up out of the tomb and they presented themselves in the temple, the people that they knew and who knew them.
Mm-hmm.
So, like I said, there's a big mystery here that I would want to go very carefully with that because I really don't understand it.
Mm-hmm. I don't either.
There's things going on here that I don't think we'll understand until it's explained.
Mm-hmm. That passage in Matthew that talks about the dead being raised on the day of crucifixion is not a resurrection event. It's a resuscitation event. And probably from some of the echoes of Lazarus' experience and also a bit of logic applied to the situation and a general understanding, everybody that's resuscitated dies. Because there's more than one resuscitation event. It's not just Jairus' daughter. Paul will bring somebody back to life, a person who falls out of the window because the sermon was long and boring. And he fell out of the window and died, and Paul brought him back to life. Those individuals died. And we'll look at this when we look at resurrection. Death, unless Christ returns, death is necessary for the resurrection event to enter into resurrection. That's part of it. And I know when we start getting, and this is one of the dangers about the exceptions. Well, if Enoch and Elijah haven't experienced death, will they be resurrected? Because they don't seem to have experienced death. They don't seem to have experienced a physical death. Beyond that, I can't say. I really don't know. They may be exceptions to the rule. Let God deal with that. It's kind of like the passage in 1 Samuel 28. That's a very odd one. And if you start applying it to everything else, then you kind of run into trouble. And it's also dangerous to kind of cobble all of this together and to develop a nice, neat theological construct of the afterlife that includes everything clearly and abundantly, because then you just continue to run into exceptions. But the general principle is we will die, and then we will be raised from the dead, experiencing the resurrection. And that includes everybody. Even Jesus died. So however God works it out with Enoch and Elijah, I think they're going to have to experience death. They may have already. I don't know. Because I don't really know what it means that Enoch wasn't there anymore. And I sure don't understand the whole thing with Elijah being whisked away in a chariot of fire. Don't know. Well, I don't know how he was able to experience that and endure. I don't know. Maybe that was his death event. Well, not a resurrected body. We were not doing that yet. I don't know. So, some conclusions. The Old Testament demonstrates that the person is a body-soul unit. They come together. The soul does not separate from the body. It doesn't escape. There are no disembodied individuals in the Old Testament. And souls don't leave the body and enter into Sheol. This is in opposition to the pagan concept that body and soul separate. And the reason why pagan, and we'll look at this more closely with the third lesson, pagan idea is that the body is unimportant. The biblical idea is that the body is important. If it weren't important, then God wouldn't emphasize it as much as he does, especially in the New Testament.
Talking about body being important, you were talking earlier about Elijah and Elisha both bringing somebody back through
Resuscitation.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
And then Elisha's body was used, it brought somebody else back to life after he was already dead.
Mm-hmm.
So would Elijah's body have done the same?
Except it wasn't there.
God used their bodies
Mm-hmm.
to bring somebody else. I mean, their physical touching and what
Mm-hmm.
to work through. So there was something given by God for that to happen that obviously through Elisha showed that it was a lasting effect.
Mm-hmm.
Perhaps.
But it seems to me that God would have to breathe into these people because the reason why we live is because we have breath of God and this God gives us breath. I mean that's one way of thinking about it.
Mm-hmm.
Is that they have to breathe into them life, breathe into Adam life.
And if that happened, it's not explicit in the text. And how that mechanism worked, I don't know. But bodies are important.
Why did it say that Elisha's body brought somebody back. What purpose does that show other than to say the parts of the body?
Well, and you'll also notice, not every time, there are exceptions once again, but often when Jesus heals, he heals by touching. Especially touching people he's not supposed to touch. He touches the bad people, the unclean people, people who are leprous, and a woman who's bleeding and things like that. And so he touches the unclean. He uses his body to bring about healing and restoration. And Paul's very clear in 1 Corinthians 15. You better get used to these bodies because you're going to have them for eternity. Now, a resurrected body is different than the one we have now. That's true, absolutely. But the body is never abandoned. Jesus' tomb was empty. The body came out with him. And that's an important point. And John brings that out in his gospel, and it's brought out elsewhere.
Is this a good translation here when it says, when the body touched Elijah's bones? Does that indicate a passage of time?
Mm-hmm.
The bones are...
That means there's no flesh on the bones, yeah. So he's really, really dead. You can't get more dead.
Emphasizes.
Mm-hmm. And it doesn't have to be the flesh, because we kind of have that in the previous passage where Elisha's pressing his body against the other individual and warmth returns. And it could be, well, heat was transferred to heat or something like that. We don't have anything like that in this second passage in 2 Kings. It's a dead body falling on a dead prophet's bones, which means that's something unclean. Doesn't matter whether it's Elisha or some other prophet. A dead body is a dead body is a dead body is a dead body, and those are unclean. And how could something unclean bring a person back to life? Because it wasn't necessarily the unclean body, the dead body. It was God who did it. It had to be. So there's another strange exception that confuses us.
Yeah, that may be a foreshadowing of Messiah who became unclean so that we could be declared clean by taking our sins upon himself. So you see all through the Old Testament hints and foreshadowings of the Messiah.
Oh yeah, abundantly, overwhelmingly. And when you really slow down and look at these type of passages, then I think that I would love for Paul and the others to have written down all the passages that clearly told them about the Messiah. But Paul does this all the time. Well, this happened according to the scriptures. Well, which one, Paul? We want to know exactly which one. And he doesn't tell us, and the other apostles don't tell us, and the other authors of the New Testament don't tell us. But when we slow down and we look at things in a very different context, from more of a Hebraic context, then these things begin to make more sense. And when we get out of our post-enlightenment, post-scientific revolution world, and we start to think more along the lines of the 1st century BC and 5th century BC and 2nd century AD, which doesn't mean we enter into a realm of superstition, but just looking at things differently, then this type of stuff has a tendency to really open up a little bit more. If you pull back and say, well, it's not scientifically possible for a body to be raised from the dead, I think it is. It just may not be anything that we as people can do, because God is the one that's doing the resuscitating here. So anyway, so there is continuity between the Old and the New Testament and understandings of body and the afterlife. Rather than that usual misconception that the Old Testament, everyone experienced death. Death was a horrible, despairing thing. There's this dull existence in Sheol. Then the New Testament is all about life and joy and resurrection and heaven. So New Testament afterlife is good. Old Testament afterlife is maybe not bad, but dull and boring. That's not true. There's clearly continuity between the Old and the New Testament. There are Old Testament passages that are used in order to fortify the understanding in the New Testament of resurrection. Jesus uses some. The apostles also use some of these passages. So it's not, please don't do like we always do. And this is another problem with understanding the Old Testament. We always draw a line between the Old and the New Testament, separate them rather than weaving them together, because one was written in the context of the other. And especially with the book of Revelation. You want to understand Revelation, then you've got to read the book of Daniel. And not the way you think. It's never the way we think. We always get caught up in the details. Well, who are the two witnesses in chapter 11? And what's the beast? And what's the 666? What we get caught up in the details. When you've got to look at the book of Revelation, and we also have to look at the New Testament through a filter of the Old Testament. Because when Jesus is teaching from the scriptures, he's teaching from the 2/3 of our Bible. He's not teaching from the New Testament. So it's an important point. So regarding resurrection, except for key passages that we'll look at here, or at least begin to look at here in a moment, most of the Old Testament has no sense of resurrection. Resuscitation, yes, which is a foreshadowing of resurrection. There is resuscitation, but not a clear expression of resurrection. As a matter of fact, if we get to it, I'll bring up a passage in Job that basically says there is no life after death. And when we went through Ecclesiastes, if you remember, sometimes it seems like yes, sometimes it seems like no. So you can't necessarily trust the preacher, the Koheleth from Ecclesiastes regarding resurrection or an afterlife. But there is an afterlife. There seems to be some sort of intermediate state in the Old Testament. We don't go directly into God's presence, or they don't go directly into God's presence. And we're slowly building a theology in the Old Testament that is eventually going to have passages that we'll look at here in a bit that are resurrection passages, and that are used in the New Testament as resurrection passages, that are used by Jews before Jesus' time as resurrection passages. When they translate the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek, there's going to be some modifications that are made that don't detract away from the original Hebrew, but enhance it because there's a developing doctrine of resurrection, of not resuscitation, but of real resurrection. And part of the problem is we don't exactly know where that comes from. I think I do. I think N.T. Wright and others do, but I'm not really sure.
Are you saying you don't know where it comes from? Are you talking about changing the translation of those passages?
When the Dead Sea Scrolls and the Septuagint modify the Masoretic text or the Hebrew text, and they couch the language in a way that's obviously reflecting resurrection, we obviously don't know who's doing that, and we don't really know why they're doing it. We don't know the point of origin of that concept, where it begins to emerge in the 8th century or the 6th or the 5th century, and under what circumstances. It seems to slowly be emerging over a few centuries by bits and pieces, so that when we get to 250 BC, somewhere around there, among the Hebrews, among most of the Jewish people, there's a clear doctrine of resurrection. It would be really nice to know, well, it came from here. This is where it begins to emerge. With this event, God suddenly calls a prophet to expressly make statements about bodily resurrection, but he doesn't do that. It mostly emerges because the context in which the nation of Israel is living in and their experiences begin to develop through a different, not a departure from the original text, but almost an enhancement of the original text to begin to develop that concept.
You're saying that at 250 BC, the nation of Israel was going through that improved way of looking at the text?
In the 250 BC, after that, before that, 5th century, 6th century, 8th century, there seem to be experiences that are creating a new understanding of certain passages. It's kind of like the origin of it is just on the other side of the horizon, and we can't see on the other side of the horizon. We can see where it starts to come toward us, and as it gets closer in time, it gets clearer and clearer. So when it's closer to us chronologically and historically, it's resurrection. And where it departs from us, it seems like resurrection, and there are certain things that are influencing that interpretation, and then it fades, and then it goes over the horizon. What a lot of people want to say, well, the Jews got it from the Persians and the Greeks. That's where it came from. No, any other questions? Let's move on. That's not That's not, and I'll address that. That's not where it comes from. So, how about I just introduce Old Testament resurrection, because there's about 4 or 5 really important passages that I want to look at, because we're kind of getting low on time, and I don't want to just barely begin it. So, Old Testament resurrection, once again, resuscitation is the same old body that's been brought back to life. Resurrection is the same old body that's been brought back to life, to a new life, but it's still the same person, I guess is a better way of saying it. And as I just mentioned, many believe that the concept of resurrection is not found in the Old Testament. It's not there. You want resurrection? Go to the New Testament. Well, I hope to demonstrate next week it's in the Old Testament. I think I will demonstrate next week. It is in the Old Testament. Some say it doesn't come about until sometime close to 3rd, 2nd century BC. You got to wait real late in the history of the Jews in the intertestamental period before they begin to develop the concept. We'll look at passages from Daniel, 1 from Isaiah, and 2 from Hosea that are well before 3rd, 2nd century BC that are pointing us toward resurrection. And then some people say, well, it comes from the Persian concept of reconstitution. That's the word that's often used. Reconstitution of the body. There's no indication, and I'll talk about it next week, there's no indication that it comes from outside of Judaism. It's not coming from the Persians. It's not coming from the Greeks, because they have a different view of the body. They have a different view of the person. They don't have the idea that the body is good and their gods retain it. If there is any sense of restoring life to an individual, it's very different than we find in the Old Testament. But the New Testament instances of resuscitation and the concept of bodily resurrection both come from the Old Testament. Instances and ideas that we see regarding bodily resurrection and resuscitation are based upon Old Testament principles. And once again, 1 Corinthians 15:4, Paul stated that Jesus' resurrection was according to the Scriptures. What exactly he meant by that, what Scriptures he meant, we don't know. There's that phrase, he was buried, that he was raised on the 3rd day according to the Scriptures. So Paul is indicating, if Paul were here, he would look at us and say, why are you discussing, or not maybe us, but other people that say there is no Old Testament resurrection? Paul would say, absolutely. Where do you think I got it from? I got it from the Old Testament, the Scriptures, the only Scriptures that he had. It's there. And it's not there if you look at it just right and then you pass it through the Gospels. It's there. It's resurrection. You can call it Old Testament resurrection, but it's the same thing that we're going to be talking about when we get into the New Testament. Old Testament resurrection is clearly, abundantly, overwhelmingly there. And it doesn't come from the Persians. It doesn't come from the Greeks. Some have said, well, the idea slowly develops during the prophetic period in 8th, 7th century with the Canaanites. And because they have deities that are their fertility gods or vegetable deities that die and raise and die and raise from the dead. They die and raise. And so it's kind of the same thing. It's not the same thing. The concept of resurrection doesn't come from outside of Judaism. It comes from inside Judaism. And I think the simple understanding is God slowly develops it, and he does it for some very specific reasons. One of them is to make sure that everybody knows this is our concept. This is my concept, God is telling them. It's not coming from outside. It's coming from inside. It's here in the text. You just need to be able to see it and understand certain passages in a new and unique way. So once again, I'll put the passages in the email. I'll let you know which ones they are in case you want to jot them down and mark them in your Bible so you don't have to do Bible drill this week. But we'll look at specifically 5 passages from the Old Testament that are clear indicators of resurrection. Not simply reconstitution or resuscitation, but are clearly instances of resurrection. Any questions before we?
You get so many ideas about what it is in the Bible, and things that happen, like you say, that are not like resurrection. I think the idea is that.
Well, I think we as Christians have a tendency to gloss over things, to oversimplify it. And this includes me. I'm not applying this to anybody else in this room, but we have a tendency to get lazy, or we hear something and we think, well, this is what it means, and let's not really press the issue or look in the context or compare it to other passages. I just want a simple answer. And that's what most people want. Usually at a funeral or something along those lines, but when we're not in the funeral setting and we don't have to give an affirming, supportive statement to somebody, I think it's helpful when we slow down and really look at these passages and try to understand them in their original context. This is good biblical exegesis. This is what you do. This is what I was trained to do. You look at it in its context, in its historic context. You look at it in its scriptural context. And our own ideas, our own tendencies to oversimplify things have a tendency to fall away. Now, at the end of this process, if you're a little more confused and you're not really sure, welcome to the club. Because it's like this with a lot of things. Everything's not abundantly clear. But we'll try to do some snapshots at the end to make it as clear as possible. Rather than just, I'm not going to end this series with, there's no clear definitive answer, so go away never knowing anything and not being able to tell anybody something affirming who's experienced the death of a loved one. I think we can say things that will affirm and support somebody who's lost somebody, or ourselves, because there's a word that is always connected to even these allegorical or foreshadowing passages about resurrection, and that's hope. There's hope in all of this. This is one of the things, if you can't pull anything else from this series, get this: there's hope. God is not done with us. The world thinks, well, this is it. You're born, you die, your body evaporates, and that's the end, annihilationism. Or people have oversimplistic views of what the afterlife is, where the door's wide open and everybody goes in. As long as you're not an Adolf Hitler or a Joseph Stalin, everybody goes to heaven, right? No, it's not that simple. But there is hope. We have a genuine hope. And I think that needs to be the overriding theme of all of this. We can look at the particulars, and we will, and we'll look at unique passages, and we will, and we'll draw some conclusions, and we won't draw some conclusions. Well, one thing you can definitely draw from this: we have hope. God ain't done with us, like we say in Texas. He ain't done with us. And he's not even done with our bodies, which is another word of hope, whether we believe it or not. Let me end this with prayer. Father, we are grateful for this time that we have to explore your word. And sometimes it's not always clear, and sometimes it can develop into greater clarity. I pray that we would understand as best we can, but I also know we don't have to understand everything. We only need to trust you. And by trusting you, we have hope. However it plays out, however it all works out, in the end, you are in control. In the end, you love us and care about us, and you've never abandoned us, and you never will. And you have given us hope through Christ. Whatever the details are, whatever the particulars are, when we leave this life, we know this is not the end. We know that you are there waiting for us as much as you are here with us. Be with us as we enter into a time of worship, that we would continue to hear your word, to grow, to learn, to mature, and to be prepared for the ministry that you have set for us this week. For it's in Christ's name I pray. Amen. Thanks, everyone.